Every 100 years, like clockwork, the world's most powerful currency dies, not weakens, not declines, dies. And right now, in 2026, we are exactly 82 years into the American dollar's reign as the world's reserve currency. Let me show you something that should absolutely terrify you. The Portuguese real dominated global trade for 80 years, then it collapsed. The Spanish real ruled for 110 years, then it collapsed. The Dutch guilder, 80 years, collapsed. The French franc, 100 years, collapsed. The British pound, 105 years, collapsed. Do you see the pattern? Every single reserve currency in the last 500 years has lasted roughly 1 century. Sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, but never much longer. 3 to 4 generations of dominance, then death. The American dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. Do the math. That's 82 years. We're not at the beginning of our reign, we're not even in the middle. We're in the danger zone. We're right at the point where history says the cracks should be appearing. And here's what nobody wants to tell you. The cracks are already here. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what happens when a reserve currency dies, how it happens, why it happens, and most importantly, the warning signs that appear right before the collapse. Because every single one of those warning signs, every single pattern that preceded the death of the Portuguese real, the Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the French franc, and the British pound, is happening in America right now. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now, the rhyme is almost perfect. Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you'll never look at your dollar bills the same way again. The day the world's money died, March 15th, 1973. Richard Nixon is in the Oval Office. The Vietnam War is draining America's gold reserves. Inflation is spiraling out of control. And the president is about to make a decision that will change the course of human history forever. He picks up a pen and signs an executive order that ends the Bretton Woods system. The dollar, which had been backed by gold since World War II, is now backed by nothing but trust, nothing but a promise, nothing but faith in American power. At the time, economists called it brilliant, a necessary evolution, the birth of the modern monetary system. But here's what they didn't tell you. That moment in 1973 wasn't the beginning of a new era. It was the beginning of the end. Because every single time in history that a nation has unlinked its currency from tangible value, the same pattern has played out. First comes the freedom to print, then comes the addiction to debt, then comes the denial, and finally comes the collapse. It has happened to every reserve currency in history. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the French franc, the British pound. Every single one followed the exact same trajectory from dominance to decline to death. And right now, in 2026, the American dollar is further down that road than most people realize. Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you'll never look at your bank account the same way again. The lifespan of a reserve currency. There's a cycle to these things. It's not random. It's not bad luck. It's as predictable as the changing seasons. Every reserve currency in history has gone through the same 4 phases. And if you know what to look for, you can see exactly where we are right now. Phase 1. The rise. This is when a nation becomes economically dominant through genuine productivity. Their currency becomes the global standard, not because they force it, but because everyone wants it. The Dutch guilder earned its status in the 1600s by financing global trade through the Dutch East India Company. The British pound earned it in the 1800s by fueling the Industrial Revolution. The American dollar earned it in the 1940s by producing half of the world's manufactured goods. Phase 2. The peak. This is the golden age. The currency is dominant. Borrowing is cheap. The nation can run deficits without consequence because the world needs their money. Life is good. Citizens enjoy a standard of living their productivity doesn't quite justify. The nation starts to believe the good times will last forever. This is where the rot begins. Phase 3. The decline. Economic rivals emerge. The nation's share of global production falls. But the currency remains dominant through inertia. The world is used to it. The infrastructure is built around it. Changing would be inconvenient. So even as the foundation crumbles, the facade remains strong. The nation begins to weaponize its currency. Sanctions, embargoes, financial blackmail, They mistake the privilege of having a reserve currency for a right, for a weapon they can use without consequence. Phase 4. The collapse. Confidence breaks. It usually happens faster than anyone expects, often triggered by a single event that reveals what has been true for years. The currency that seemed invincible yesterday becomes a liability today. Countries dump their reserves. Trade shifts to alternatives. The former hegemon watches helplessly as decades of privilege vanish in months or even weeks. Sound familiar? It should. Because America is deep into Phase 3, and the signs of Phase 4 are starting to appear everywhere. The Spanish lesson. Let me take you back to 1640. Spain is the undisputed superpower of the world. Spanish silver from the mines of Portuguese is the global currency. When merchants in Amsterdam trade with merchants in Beijing, they use Spanish reals. When kings store their treasuries, they store Spanish silver. Spain is wealthy beyond imagination. The Spanish fleet brings back shiploads of gold and silver from the New World. The Spanish monarchy has unlimited spending power. They finance wars across Europe. They build palaces. They fund art and culture. They live like gods. But here's the thing about finding treasure. It makes you forget how to create value. While Spain was spending its silver, the Dutch were building ships. While Spain was fighting religious wars, the English were developing new technologies. While Spain was extracting wealth from its colonies, its rivals were building actual productive economies. By the early 1600s, Spain was producing almost nothing the world wanted except the silver itself. They were importing everything: food, clothes, tools, weapons, everything. They had money but no economy, and then the silver started to run out. The mines of the New World were being depleted. The costs of extraction were rising. The flow of precious metals was slowing to a trickle. Spain's response? They debased their currency. They started mixing copper with silver. They reduced the metal content in their coins. They printed money, essentially, trying to maintain their lifestyle as their actual wealth disappeared. The result was predictable. Inflation exploded. The real lost 50%, then 70%, then 90% of its value. Countries stopped accepting Spanish currency. Spain, which had been the world's banker, became the world's cautionary tale. By 1650, Spain was effectively bankrupt. By 1700, it was a second-rate power. The transition from superpower to has-been took less than one generation. The lesson? Having lots of money doesn't make you rich if you're not producing anything of value. And you cannot print your way to prosperity forever. Eventually, the world figures out the con. America, take note. The Dutch decline. Here's where it gets interesting. After Spain fell, the Dutch guilder became the world's reserve currency. And the Dutch made the exact same mistake Spain had made. Different details, same pattern. The Netherlands in the 1600s was an economic miracle. They pioneered modern capitalism, developed sophisticated financial markets, and built a trading empire that spanned the globe. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation in history. Amsterdam was the financial capital of the world. Dutch prosperity was built on trade, innovation, and finance. They created the first modern stock exchange, the first central bank, the first government bonds. They were the Silicon Valley of their era. But wealth has a way of making people soft. By the 1700s, the Dutch were no longer building and innovating. They were renting out their wealth. Dutch investors financed British factories, French plantations, and American ventures. They became a nation of rentiers, living off the returns from their accumulated capital rather than creating new value. The Dutch military, once formidable, became a joke. They relied on mercenaries while their rivals built professional armies. When wars came, the Netherlands repeatedly had to pay off aggressors because they could no longer defend themselves. Sound familiar? It should. America's military is strong, but our manufacturing is in China. Our technology is innovative, but our infrastructure is crumbling. We finance the world, but we're consuming more than we produce. The end came for the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. France invaded and occupied the Netherlands. The guilder, which had been the world's safest currency, became worthless almost overnight. Dutch wealth, stored in bonds and financial instruments, evaporated. The transition from global reserve currency to regional irrelevance took about 80 years. But the final collapse, when confidence broke, took less than a decade. The lesson? Financial sophistication is not a substitute for real productive capacity, and military weakness plus financial dependence is a recipe for disaster. The pattern reveals itself. Let me show you something that should terrify you. I'm going to list the reserve currencies of the last 500 years and how long they lasted. Portuguese real, about 80 years as the dominant currency. Spanish real, about 110 years. Dutch guilder, about 80 years. French franc, about 100 years. British pound, about 105 years. Notice anything? They all last roughly 1 century. Sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. But the pattern is remarkably consistent. 3 to 4 generations of dominance, then decline. The American dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. That's 82 years. We're right in the danger zone. Right at the point where history says the cracks should be appearing. And guess what? The cracks are appearing. The warning signs are everywhere. Here's what nobody wants to talk about. The dollar's dominance is already fading, right now, in real time. It's just happening slowly enough that most people don't notice. In 2001, the dollar accounted for 73% of global foreign exchange reserves. Today, it's down to about 58%. That's a massive decline. Countries are actively diversifying away from dollars. In 2010, nearly all oil transactions were conducted in dollars. Today, China buys Russian oil in yuan. India buys Iranian oil in rupees. Saudi Arabia is considering accepting yuan for oil sales to China. The petrodollar system that has propped up American currency since the 1970s is cracking. The BRICS nations have announced plans for a common currency to bypass the dollar entirely. Whether they succeed or not is almost beside the point. The fact that they're trying, the fact that major economies are openly discussing alternatives to the dollar, tells you everything you need to know about where we are in the cycle. This is Phase 3 behavior. This is what happened before every other reserve currency collapsed. Rivals emerge, alternatives are explored, the world starts hedging its bets. And America's response has been to accelerate the very behaviors that are driving countries away. The weaponization mistake. Here's where it gets really dangerous. Every dying reserve currency makes the same fatal error in its final phase. It weaponizes its monetary dominance. Britain did this in the early 1900s. They used the pound as a tool of imperial control, forcing colonies to hold British currency and punishing nations that tried to trade in alternatives. It worked for a while, until it didn't. Countries got tired of being bullied and started looking for exits. America is doing the exact same thing right now, just with more sophistication. We freeze the assets of countries we don't like. We cut them off from the SWIFT payment system. We sanction nations, companies, and individuals. We use the dollar as a weapon to enforce our foreign policy preferences. And every time we do this, we give the rest of the world a reason to find alternatives. When we froze Russian central bank assets after the Ukraine invasion, we sent a message to every country on Earth. If you hold your reserves in dollars, America can take them away anytime they want. That's not safety, that's vulnerability. China got the message, so did Saudi Arabia, so did India. They're all quietly reducing their dollar exposure, building alternative payment systems, signing bilateral trade agreements in local currencies. We think we're punishing our enemies. We're actually destroying the very foundation of our economic power. We're teaching the world how to live without dollars. This is exactly what Britain did with the pound. They thought their currency dominance was a weapon they could use without consequence. They learned, too late, that it was actually a privilege that required the willing cooperation of the rest of the world. The moment that cooperation ended, the pound's dominance ended with it. Math doesn't lie. Let's talk numbers, because ultimately, reserve currency status comes down to trust, and trust comes down to math. Britain lost the pound's reserve status when their debt exceeded their ability to repay it, when the math stopped making sense. America's national debt is now over $36 trillion. That's larger than our entire economy. We're adding to it at a rate of roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. Interest payments on that debt now exceed $1 trillion per year. Think about that. We're borrowing money to pay the interest on money we already borrowed. That's the definition of a debt spiral. That's what happens right before bankruptcy. But America is different, you might say. We can print our own currency. We can never default. That's technically true. We can always print dollars to pay dollar-denominated debts. But here's what that misses. Printing money to pay debts is default by another name. It's default through inflation rather than default through non-payment. And the result is the same. Your creditors lose confidence. Your currency loses value. Your reserve status ends. Every failed reserve currency discovered this truth eventually. You cannot print your way to prosperity. You cannot borrow your way to wealth. The math always catches up. And the math is catching up to America right now. What comes next? Here's the part that keeps me up at night. The transition from reserve currency to ordinary currency doesn't happen gradually. It happens in a rush. One day, you're the world's money. The next day, you're not. The change happens faster than anyone expects because it's driven by psychology, by confidence, by fear. Think about a bank run. For years, a bank can be insolvent, technically bankrupt, and nobody notices because everyone assumes their deposits are safe. But the moment confidence breaks, the moment people start to wonder if the bank is sound, everyone rushes to withdraw their money at once. The bank fails in hours, not years. That's how reserve currencies die. Slowly, then suddenly. The British pound was still dominant in 1950. By 1960, it was essentially finished as a reserve currency. 10 years. That's how fast it happened when confidence finally broke. For America, the trigger could be anything. A debt ceiling crisis that goes wrong, a military humiliation, a major country announcing they're dumping their dollar reserves, a financial crisis we can't print our way out of. We won't see it coming. That's the nature of confidence breaks. They're obvious in retrospect and invisible beforehand. The human cost. Let me tell you what happens to ordinary people when a reserve currency falls. Because this isn't an abstract economic concept. This is about your life, your savings, your future. When the pound collapsed, British citizens watched their purchasing power evaporate. Imports became unaffordable. The lifestyle they'd taken for granted disappeared within a generation. Britain went from a nation where the middle class could afford servants to a nation where the middle class could barely afford heating. If the dollar loses reserve status, every American will feel it. Everything we import, and we import almost everything, will cost dramatically more. Your savings will lose value. Your wages won't keep up with inflation. Your standard of living will decline. The comfortable American lifestyle, cheap gas, affordable consumer goods, endless variety at low prices, all of that depends on the dollar's reserve status. It depends on the rest of the world being willing to sell us real goods in exchange for paper we can print infinitely. When that arrangement ends, and history says it will end, Americans will discover what it means to live within our means. It won't be pretty. What you can do. I'm not telling you this to make you panic. I'm telling you because knowledge is power, and preparation is everything. First, understand that this is a long-term trend, not an overnight catastrophe. The dollar won't collapse tomorrow. But it is weakening, and that weakness is accelerating. Second, diversify. Don't keep all your wealth in dollar-denominated assets. Consider hard assets, foreign currencies, skills that will have value regardless of which currency is dominant. Third, reduce your dependence on the system. The people who survive currency collapses are the ones who aren't completely dependent on the currency. They have real skills, real assets, real relationships. Fourth, pay attention to the warning signs. When you see major countries signing trade deals in non-dollar currencies, that's a warning sign. When you see foreign central banks reducing their dollar reserves, that's a warning sign. When you see American politicians promising spending they can't pay for, that's a warning sign. History is screaming at us right now. Every pattern, every indicator, every lesson from the past is telling us the same thing. The dollar's dominance is not permanent. Reserve currency status is not a birthright. What happened to Spain, to the Netherlands, to France, to Britain can happen to America. The only question is when, and whether we'll be ready when it does. The final warning. In 1956, British leaders went to bed believing they still ruled the world. They woke up to discover they were a second-rate power whose currency survived only at America's pleasure. The transition from delusion to reality took 11 days. American leaders today believe the dollar's dominance is permanent, that the rules don't apply to us, that we can keep borrowing and printing and spending without consequence. History says we're wrong. The math says we're wrong. And the warning signs say time is running out. 2026 might not be the year the dollar falls, but it's definitely the year we should wake up to the fact that it can fall. And if we don't change course, if we don't learn from history, if we don't start making hard choices now, then one day soon, we're going to have our own Suez moment. And when that day comes, it will be too late to prepare. The empire always falls. The reserve currency always fades. The only variable is whether the people saw it coming. Now you've been warned. I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe.